Surah 72, Al-Jinn, the hidden beings, known as the fire beings, known as the fallen angels, not because they're the same material or ever were as the Malaika or the unfallen angels. These are the male and female beings, and just as we talked about Surah 50, they're mentioned in 31 verses, which is interesting considering the refrain repeated 31 times in Surah 55, but it takes its name from a word in the first verse, and also from the subject of verses 1 through 18. The meaning of the word jinn in Al-Quran has exercised the minds of Muslim commentators, ancient and modern. Mr. Yaqub Hassan of Madras, in the first volume of a remarkable work in Urdu, Kitabul Huda, shows that it has at least 3 meanings in Al-Quran, and that one of those meanings is something akin to clever foreigners, as in the case of the jinn who worked for Solomon, but undoubtedly the first and obvious meaning is the elemental spirits to whom, as to mankind, the Quran came as guidance. The incident is said to have occurred in the Prophet's return from his successful missionary journey to Ta'if. It's a late Meccan surah, Surah 73, and 46, 29 through 32 are also important ones that of the same vein as that chapter. Surah 73, Al-Muzammil, the enshrouded one, takes its title from a word in verse 1. After his first trance and vision, the Prophet went with his wife Khadijah and told her to wrap him up in cloaks, and that was afterwards his habit on such occasions. At any rate, in the early days at Mecca, a very early Meccan revelation with the exception of the last verse, which all authorities assign to Al-Madinah. I don't know, all authorities assign verse 20 to that, but Surah 74, Al-Mudaththir, the cloaked one, takes its name from a word in verse 1. The Prophet was accustomed to wrap himself up in his cloak at the time of his trances, or thereafter, or he was wrapped up by his wife. A tradition states that sometime about 6 months elapsed between the first revelation, Surah 96, verse 1 through 5, and the second revelation in this surah. The Prophet suddenly again beheld the angel who had appeared to him on Mount Hira and wrapped himself in his cloak, whereupon the surah was revealed to him. Another opinion is that by this surah the Prophet was ordered to begin his public preaching of al-Islam, his preaching having until then been done privately among his family and intimates. He is said to have begun his public preaching 3 years after his call, and in either case is the early Meccan surah. And Surah 75, Al-Qiyamah, takes its name from a word in the first verse, an early Meccan surah, the rising of the dead. Well, the rising, more explicitly. Yeah, a lot of these have this wave of sound that is very interesting. Adahar, time, or al-insan, humanity, is, in either case, so called from a word in the very first verse, an early Meccan surah. We're saying man as, in a gender-neutral plurals, Surah 77, the emissaries, Al-Mursalat, takes its name from a word in the first verse. Verses 1, 2, and 3 are taken to refer to winds, verses 4 and 5 to angels, and early Meccan surah. Now, there are those who refer some of these verses to other things too, as said in other things, that there's multiple things referred to in some of these chapters. And, it's not conflicting, it's just, this is a reference to even, different categories of things. So, a broad use. Everything. The Quran gives spiritual guidance to respond to everything. Surah 78, An-Naba, the tidings, takes its name from a word in the second verse, an early Meccan surah. And you notice that relates to the word Nabi, the news bringer, the exemplar prophets were news bringers. In other languages, that word takes on the meaning of, they bring out the inner fruit, so they're the exemplar prophets. Surah 79, those who break forth. An-Naziat takes its name from a word in the first verse, an early Meccan surah. Obviously, it just totally makes sense. The afterlife would be driven primarily by such a response. That's different. Your belief in your deeds, you're clinging to this world for itself. It's all that's are not is all that's going to affect how you go when you're taken. But you're going to die, and this body's not going to be your vehicle anymore, whether you like it or not. Surah 80, Abasa, he frowned. Takes its name from the very first word. One day when the Prophet was in conversation with one of the great men of the Quraysh, his own tribe, seeking to persuade him of the truth of al-Islam, a blind man came and asked a question concerning the faith. And there was frowning, annoyance at the interruption, frowning and turning away from the blind man. In the surah, he's told that a man's importance is not to be judged from his appearance or worldly station, an early Meccan surah. Now, this is one of there's narrations that come through a particular individual, that pretty much everything that sounds negative about the Prophet comes through these certain individuals, or is attributed to have come through these certain individuals. And that's what the Sunnis say. But the Shia have narrations that it was others who had that sort of problem in other areas that their tradition did preserve. And that makes the most sense. That it wasn't the Prophet who was correcting other people's actions, but if you have an aversion and make a gesture and then go on, it's not too much of a mistake to say that issue in the first place. Just like, was it Surah 3? Something said, or it could have been not the Prophet. Again, it's interesting to see the differences in the traditions. Surah 81, Al-Takwir, the overthrowing takes its name from a word in verse 1. Verses 8 and 9 contain an allusion to the practice of the polytheistic Arabs of burying alive girl children whom they deemed superfluous, an early Meccan surah. Now, in the Western world, feminist countries, the female offspring are still more likely to be chosen for abortion than the male offspring. The cleaving, Al-Infitar, takes its name from a word in verse 1, an early Meccan surah. 83, At-Tafif, defrauding, takes its name from a word in verse 1, an early Meccan surah. Surah 84, Al-Inshiqaq, the sundering, takes its name from a word in verse 1, an early Meccan surah. 85, Al-Buruj, the mansions of the stars. Some say the houses of the stars, like the 12 divisions of the, the direction of the sky in general, or something, but there's some wide meanings to some of these mentions that, refer to the stars and, the things in the heavens. Word in verse 1, which I translated, the mansion of the stars. The word has a meaning of towers or mansions and is applied to the signs of the zodiac. In verses 4 to 7, they're generally taken to refer to the massacres of the Christians at Najran in Al-Yaman by a Jewish king, Vu Nawas, an event of great historical importance since it caused the intervention of the Nagas and led to an Abyssinian supremacy in Yaman, which lasted until the War of the Elephant. Surah 105 refers to that. In the Prophet's year of birth, Professor Horowitz thinks that the words owners of the ditch of the fuel-fed fire refer not to any historical event, but the condition of all persecutors in the hereafter. An early Meccan surah, Surah 86. Tariq, the morning star, takes its name from a word in verse 1. There are other meanings to this word, Tariq, but I have chosen that which must have occurred to every hearer of this surah, especially as in verse 3 it is stated that a star is meant. The morning star is here a mystic sense and is taken to refer to the Prophet himself. Some have thought that it refers to a comet which alarmed the East about the time of the Prophet's call. Others believe that this and other introductory verses, hard to elucidate, hide scientific facts unimagined at the period of revelation, and are related to the verses following them. Qamrawi Bey and my collaborator in the revision of this work informed me that the late Dr. Sidqeh, among others, considered that the reference here is to a fertilizing germ penetrating the ovary. The subject is the same as verse 5 through 7 in early Meccan Surah. Now, if you talk about where things were as a fetus or where things start before they're processed into other things, there's accuracy in verse 7 that people, try to twist to not being such, because they're the ones with an oversimplified view of reproduction and such. Surah 87, Allah, the Most High, takes its name from a word in verse 1 and early Meccan Surah. Surah 88, Al-Ghashiyah, the overwhelming. Did I say the Most High is the other one? Al-Ghashiyah, 88, the overwhelming takes its name from a word in verse 1 and early Meccan Surah. 89, Al-Fajr, the dawn, takes its name from verse 1, a very early Meccan Surah. And there's been some analogies drawn between the, obviously it refers to the last 10 nights of Ramadan, but an allusion to the first 10 days of the 12th month, Dhul Hijjah, it's implied too. Naturally you think of it. Surah 90, Al-Balad, the city, takes its name from a word in verse 1, a very early Meccan Surah. Surah 91, Ash-Shams, takes its name from a word in verse 1, a very early Meccan Surah. So, the city, the sun, and 92 is Al-Layl, the night, it takes its name from a word in verse 1, a very early Meccan Surah. Surah 93, Ad-Duha, the morning hours, takes its name from the first verse. There was an interval during which the Prophet received no revelation, and the idolaters mocked him, saying, Allah, of whom we used to hear so much, has forsaken poor Muhammad, and now hates him. Then came this revelation. The Prophet had been a leading citizen of Mecca until he received his call. Now he was regarded as a madman. He was a man near 50, and the prophecy in this surah, that the latter portion will be better for him than the former, must have seemed absurd to those who heard it, yet the latter portion of the Prophet's life, the last 10 years, is the most wonderful record of success in human history in early Meccan Surah. Surah 94, Al-Inshirah, solace, takes its name from a word in verse 1, and also from its subject, which is relief from anxiety. It is probably revealed upon the same occasion of Surah 93, and at a time when the Prophet was derided and shunned after having been respected and courted, must have struck the disbelievers as ridiculous. It refers to the inward assurance which the Prophet had received by revelation, and it also hints at the preparation of the Prophet before he was called as a prophet, and speaks of future events as accomplished as is usual in Al-Quran, the revelation coming from a plane where time is not. As in Surah 76, we have the indication that, God transcends time. Because, and we shouldn't revile time because that's like a name of God, but God is transcendent of these qualities in essence. Verse 4 speaks of his fame as exalted, but must have seemed particularly absurd in the time of humiliation and persecution. But today, from every mosque in the world, the Prophet's name is cried as that of the Messenger of God 5 times a day. Every Muslim prays for his blessings on him when his name is mentioned, an early Meccan surah. Now that fulfills a prophecy of the Bible more than Jesus or any other. We talk about the blessed name of Muhammad. Humanity mentions more. Surah 95, the fig, Atin, takes its name from a word in verse 1. The sense is mystical, referring to man in relation to the revealed law of God, his judgment, a very early Meccan surah. Surah 96, Al-Alaq, takes its name from a word in verse 2. The clod, did I say the fig? Verses 1 through 5 are the words which the Prophet received in the vision of Hira, therefore the first of the Quran to be revealed in an early Meccan surah. And, just like 97 in a way, Surah 96 kind of relates to some of that spirit towards the end, but it's the last prostration verse that ends that. So, Surah 97, Al-Qadr, power, takes its name from a word in verse 1. It refers to the night, one of the last nights of Ramadan, on which the Prophet received his call, and the first verses of the Quran were revealed in the vision of Mount Hira. Is said to be the night on which God's decrees for the year are brought down to the earthly plane, a very early Meccan surah. Well, it's not as simple as that. It's actually, he was told that there was a night where the deeds are multiplied better than 1,000 months, and he knew it was, first he was told it was in Ramadan. He spent the first 10, it wasn't into that. He spent the second 10, it wasn't the second third, it wasn't into that. And he was finally told that it was in the last third. And Ramadan's a better time to do itikaf at the masjid to begin with, but he would leave on the 19th to arrive before the 20th would start. So this is how you would observe the last 10 nights of Ramadan, because that's the way the best 10 nights of the year, you don't want to miss any of them. So do you want to leave off the, not knowing whether there's a 30th, are you going to leave off the 20th, which could be the night that year? It's not said that it couldn't be the night that year, but Surah 98, Al-Bayyinah, the clear proof, takes its name from a word in the very first verse. There's no certainty as to the period of revelation. Many regard it as a late Meccan surah. I follow the attribution in the Mus'haf, which I have followed throughout. The probable date of revelation is the first year of the Hijrah. Surah 99, Al-Zilzal, the earthquake, takes its name from a word in verse 1, a very early Meccan surah. Surah 100, Al-Adiyat, the coursers, takes its name from a word in the first verse, a very early Meccan surah. Surah 101, Al-Qariya, the calamity, takes its name from a word in verse 1, meaning recurring in the next 2 lines. Surah 102, At-Takathur, rivalry in worldly increase. But this takes its name from a word in the first verse, a very early Meccan surah. Surah 103, Al-Asr, takes its name from a word in verse 1, a very early Meccan surah. The declining day, because it's encouraging and upholding what it does. Some say if that was the only revelation, it would be sufficient, and for some people, it would. Surah 104, the traducers, Al-Humazah, takes its name from a word in verse 1. The idolaters, the misassociators, waylaid all newcomers to Mecca and warned them against the Prophet in order to prevent their listening to his preaching. An early Meccan surah, Surah 105, Al-Fil, the elephant, takes its name from a word in the first verse. The allusion is to the campaign of Abraha, the Abyssinian ruler of Al-Yaman, against Mecca, with the purpose of destroying the Kaaba. In the year of the Prophet's birth, he had with him an elephant, which much impressed the Arabs. Tradition says that the elephant refused to advance to the last stage of the march, and that the swarms of flying creatures pelted the Abyssinians with stones. Another tradition says that they retired in disorder owing to an outbreak of smallpox in the camp. At the time when the surah was revealed, many men in Mecca must have known what happened. Dr. Kurnkau, a sound Arabic scholar, is of the opinion that the flying creatures may well have been swarms of insects carrying infection, and in case the Kaaba was saved from destruction after its defenders had despaired, a very early Meccan surah, Surah 106, Ashita, the winter, or Al-Quraysh, the attachment formed from one place to another or something. A word occurring in verse 2 is often called a very early Meccan surah, Surah 106, Al-Ma'un. The small kindness takes its name from a word in the last verse. An early Meccan revelation, Surah 107, Al-Kawthar. Abundance takes its name from a word in the first verse. The disbelievers used to taunt the Prophet with the fact that he had no son and therefore none to uphold its religion after him. Surah 109, Al-Kafirun. The disbelievers takes its name from a word in verse 1. It was revealed at a time when the idolaters had asked the Prophet to compromise in matters of religion. Surah 110, Sakor. An-Nasr takes its name from a word in the first verse. It is one of the very last revelations, having come to the Prophet only a few weeks before his death. Though ascribed always to Al-Madinah, tradition says that it was actually revealed at Mecca during the days where the Prophet spent there. When he made his farewell pilgrimage, it is described in Ibn Hisham and elsewhere as the first announcement that the Prophet received of his approaching death. The date of revelation is the 10th year of the Hijrah, and Surah 111. Al-Lahab, the father of the takes his name from a word in the first verse. It's the only passage in the whole Quran where an opponent of the Prophet is denounced by name. Abu Lahab, the father of flame, whose real name was Abdul Uzza, servant of Shemyaza, basically, or the wife of Shemyaza, depending on your tradition, right? But that Nikala, the triple, was an uncle, sort of an Artemis sort of figure in a way, was an uncle of the Prophet, and was the only member of his own clan who bitterly opposed the Prophet. He made it his business to torment the Prophet, and his wife took pleasure in carrying thorn bushes and strewing them in the sand, where she knew that the Prophet was sure to walk barefooted. An early Meccan revelation. And